Okay, so you're looking to really get your head around environmental issues, right? Cut through the noise and understand what's actually going on without feeling totally overwhelmed.
Exactly. That's what we try to do here. Sift through all the information, the debates, and pull out the things that, really matter for understanding these big, complex topics.
And today we're doing a deep dive into some common ideas about environmental challenges. We've got a bunch of sources, but a key one we'll be drawing from is Michael Shellenberger's book, Apocalypse Never. It's definitely thought-provoking.
Yeah, it offers a pretty critical look at a lot of the environmental claims you hear.
Mm.
So our aim today is to kind of unpack those arguments, look at them alongside news reports, scientific findings, basically try to separate the solid science from maybe the alarmism and see what paths forward look like.
Okay, let's dive in. One of the first things the book really tackles head on is this prevalence of environmental alarmism. It kicks off with that whole Extinction Rebellion protest thing.
Right, the tube incident in London.
Yeah, people just trying to get to work, and suddenly trains are stopped. Chaos.
And the book really highlights the public reaction to that, which wasn't great. It mentions news reports, like one from this morning, showing a lot of people felt those tactics were actually, like, counterproductive.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was that incident, remember, an activist kicking a commuter.
Yeah.
That really stoked public anger.
Yeah, you can see why. And it kind of forces you to ask about the message, right? The book brings up this question. If climate change isn't literally an existential threat, like end of civilization kind of thing, then what does calling it an enormous crisis actually mean?
That's a central question. And the author, Shellenberger, he's pretty explicit about why he wrote the book.
Yeah.
He felt that exaggeration, alarmism, extremism,
Yeah.
it was all getting in the way of finding actual practical solutions.
Right. And to show what he's reacting to, the book points to some headlines from back in 2018. You had the New York Times talking about a, quote, strong risk of crisis as early as 2040.
Yeah, with that really powerful image, too, the child with animal bones. It paints a very stark, very immediate picture of disaster. That kind of framing is powerful.
Definitely. And that same day, the Washington Post had a headline saying the world had, just over a decade left to get things under control, based on UN scientists.
And the book also mentions a NASA scientist predicting, like, simultaneous food system collapses, multiple continents, all at once. These examples really stack up to show that end is nigh narrative he's pushing back against.
And it wasn't just the news headlines. The book also brings up an IPCC report, August 2019, this one on land degradation, warning about a rapidly closing window, soil disappearing way faster than it's forming. So you have these different streams all seemingly pointing to this, edge of the cliff scenario.
But then the book pivots. It starts introducing counter-arguments, more nuance. It uses the Netherlands as a really, really strong example of adaptation.
Yeah, that's a great one.
I mean, think about it. So much of their country is below sea level, yet they haven't just survived, they've flourished.
It's easy to forget that, isn't it? Their whole history is kind of a testament to human ingenuity in adapting.
Precisely. And the book argues our capacity to adapt is even greater now.
All right.
You've got Dutch experts currently helping Bangladesh figure out how to deal with rising sea levels. So adaptation isn't just history, it's happening right now.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. Shifting gears a bit. Wildfires.
Right.
The book brings in research from Dr. John Keeley, U.S. Geological Survey. He's studied California fires for ages.
Decades, yeah.
And his findings. Apparently, there isn't a consistent link between past climate conditions and how much land actually burned each year, at least not everywhere in the state.
Which really challenges that simple narrative you often hear, right? Climate change equals worse fires. It suggests other things, land management, how people start fires might be, bigger drivers in many cases.
It's definitely more complicated.
It always is.
And the book really drives home the human side of things with the author's experiences in the Eastern Congo.
Yeah, that section was powerful.
It draws this direct line between energy poverty and environmental pressure. In Goma, this city of millions, the main fuel is wood.
Still wood and charcoal, yeah, for cooking, heating, everything.
And that puts incredible strain on the forests nearby. It just shows how basic survival needs can drive environmental damage when people don't have alternatives.
And it's not just about having resources, it's about the whole system. The book makes this really interesting point about conflict. It suggests that low GDP, like overall economic weakness, is a stronger predictor of armed conflict than just not having enough resources.
Huh. How do they show that?
Well, they contrast Japan, resource poor, but wealthy and peaceful, with the Congo, which is incredibly resource-rich but struggles with instability.
Right.
And the book touches on why the Congo's huge size, the legacy of Belgian colonization, which didn't exactly build strong institutions,
Yeah.
it shows that just having stuff underground doesn't guarantee peace or prosperity.
And the book doesn't shy away from addressing some of the really extreme predictions either. It mentions that claim by Sarah Lunnan from Extinction Rebellion.
The one about billions dying from 4 degrees of warming.
Yeah, that one.
And the author's response is basically, well, where's that coming from? Because you don't find predictions like that in the actual IPCC reports, which are supposed to be the scientific consensus.
It brings it back to that alarmism versus science distinction again.
Exactly.
Okay, so shifting towards solutions, or at least different perspectives on the future, the book makes this claim about the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO,
Yeah.
that in their future scenarios, technological progress actually makes a bigger difference than the direct impacts of climate change itself.
That's a big statement. It suggests that innovation in farming, energy, how we use resources, that can be hugely impactful. Maybe even more impactful than just focusing solely on cutting emissions, though obviously that's important too.
It puts a lot of emphasis on human ingenuity then.
It does. And the book mentions this workshop back in 2006, organized by Roger Pielke Jr. They brought together experts, even people from Munich Reinsurance.
Oh, wow. The big insurance company, they'd have a stake in getting the risk assessment right.
You bet. The idea was to really objectively look at the links between human-caused climate change and disaster trends. It highlights the need for, rigorous science, especially when big money is involved.
And thinking about how societies respond, the book loops back to the Netherlands again, that huge flood they had in 1953.
A real turning point. It led to massive investment in their flood defenses, the Delta Works. It shows how societies can learn from disaster and adapt proactively.
The book also brings in Michael Oppenheimer's views on managing future sea level rise.
Right. He talks about a mix of things, raising buildings, maybe strategic retreat in some really vulnerable places.
And he apparently felt the displacement after Hurricane Sandy in New York, while obviously awful for those involved, was ultimately manageable. It didn't cause, societal collapse.
Yeah, suggesting we have the capacity to handle these kinds of disruptions, even if they're significant.
But to keep it grounded, the book shares that story about Bernadette in the Congo.
Oh yeah, the baboons eating her sweet potatoes.
It just brings these huge global issues down to this very personal level of survival, doesn't it? And that little detail about her childhood memory, getting clothes and money from family in Goma, it just adds that human touch.
It really does. It reminds you what's at stake on a personal level.
But all this talk of potential disaster, it takes a toll, right? The book talks about the mental health impacts. Lauren Jeffrey, the teenager who got really anxious.
Eco-anxiety. It's a real thing.
Yeah.
The book cites studies linking climate alarmism, especially constant doom and gloom stuff, to rising anxiety and depression, particularly in kids.
Yeah, I've read about that. The American Psychological Association flagged it back in 2017.
And British psychologists, too. There's that UK survey in 2020 where kids were literally having nightmares about climate change. It's serious.
So keeping perspective is important. The book tries to do that by mentioning other big threats we faced recently.
Like that asteroid that kind of snuck up on NASA.
Yeah. And the volcano in New Zealand, the pandemic in 2020. It's not to downplay climate change, but to remember it's one major challenge among others we navigate.
Right, context matters.
The author, Shellenberger, he has this long history with environmental stuff, right? Amnesty, trips to Nicaragua, Brazil.
Yeah, he was even at the big UN Earth Summit in Rio back in '92. Deforestation was huge then, so he's seen how the conversation has shifted over decades.
And the book points out this tension. Developed countries got rich, partly by cutting down forests, using fossil fuels,
Right.
and now there's pressure on developing countries not to do the same thing. It can seem a bit hypocritical sometimes.
It's a definite point of friction. But the book also highlights some good news, as it calls it, like forests actually expanding in many places globally.
Really? Expanding?
Yeah, and the total area burned by wildfires worldwide actually decreased between 1998 and 2015. And interestingly, it links these trends to economic growth and urbanization.
How does that work?
Well, as economies develop and more people move to cities, there's often less pressure on land for subsistence farming, allowing forests to potentially recover.
Huh. Okay. And Schellenberger's time in places like Nicaragua, seeing real poverty firsthand, the book suggests that gives him a different perspective than maybe some environmentalists in wealthy countries.
He argues it does. He contrasts those experiences with what he sees as sometimes, well, maybe insensitive views from afar. He says understanding deforestation in Brazil, for example, means understanding their drive to lift millions out of poverty. Environmental policy needs to grapple with that reality.
The book also digs into the history of how humans have shaped landscapes. It's not always pristine nature.
Not at all. It mentions the Maori arriving in New Zealand and the impact on the Moa population. Big impact.
And the idea that meadows, which we might think of as natural, were often actively maintained by hunter-gatherers using fire.
Exactly. And even how Europeans saw the Amazon change. It went from being this terrifying jungle to a more romantic rainforest as their own societies got wealthier and more urban. Our perception of nature isn't static.
The book gets pretty critical of some environmental groups' policies, using Greenpeace in Brazil as a key example.
Yeah, it argues that their approach, maybe not fully grasping Brazil's development needs, might have accidentally made rainforest fragmentation worse, pushing cattle ranching further out.
How so?
The book suggests focusing more on intensification. Growing more food on the land already cleared might have been better than a blanket opposition. It also criticizes conflating the Amazon rainforest with the Cerrado savanna, which are ecologically distinct.
And there was that World Bank report in 2008 pushing for small, local, organic farming.
Right, and the book says Greenpeace then pressured European companies to stop buying Brazilian soy altogether. It quotes a researcher, Nepstad, who suggests a lot of the anti-farming push is ideological anti-development, anti-capitalist, and maybe not applied consistently.
So what's the alternative proposed? More pragmatic conservation.
Pretty much. The book argues for repairing relationships with farmers in the Amazon, finding solutions that allow sustainable intensification, especially in places like the Cerrado, while also creating and properly managing protected areas in the rainforest itself.
A mix and match approach.
Yeah, not just saying no.
And you know that stat, the Amazon producing 20% of the world's oxygen?
Oh yeah, everyone quotes that.
The book says that's actually a myth. It traces it back to an old article from the 60s that was corrected in the journal Science way back in 1970.
Wow. That's a good reminder to check sources, even for widely believed facts.
Okay, let's switch to waste. Ocean plastic. Big issue.
It's huge.
The book's take is that rich nations should focus on helping poorer nations improve their basic trash collection, because that's where most of the plastic is getting into the ocean from.
Right, where collection rates are lowest. It argues that investing in proper waste management infrastructure in developing countries is probably the single most effective thing we could do about ocean plastic.
It points out the big cost difference between just open dumping and managed landfills, but says the investment is crucial.
Yeah, fundamental.
And to broaden the view on ocean threats, the author shares this anecdote from New Zealand, Emil, visiting a penguin sanctuary, and uses it to argue that the intense focus on plastic might be distracting us from other major threats.
Like what?
Well, the IUCN points to habitat loss for sea turtles from coastal development, aquaculture, and the IPCC itself apparently highlights overfishing as a massive issue for marine ecosystems, maybe even bigger than plastic in some ways.
So plastic is bad, obviously, but don't let it eclipse everything else.
That seems to be the point, and it uses the tortoiseshell trade example.
Oh, driven by demand for luxury goods in Japan.
Exactly, to show that our instinct to prefer natural things isn't always good. That demand decimated hawksbill turtles until the trade was banned in '77. Sometimes synthetic alternatives are actually better for conservation.
That's a really interesting point. Counterintuitive.
Now, extinction rates. We hear scary numbers all the time. The book looks at the science behind them, specifically the species area model.
Right, that model from the 60s that links habitat size to the number of species it can support.
But the book cites a 2011 study in Nature saying that model actually overestimates extinction rates from habitat loss.
Really? How so?
Apparently, it takes more habitat loss than the model predicts to actually cause extinctions. And get this, on islands, biodiversity has often doubled on average because of introduced species.
Doubled. Wow. So invasive isn't always purely negative.
Seems more complex. And in Europe, new plant introductions have apparently far outnumbered extinctions. Even one of the model's original creators acknowledged its limitations later on.
So the pictures may be less bleak, or at least more dynamic, than the simple models suggest.
Back to the Congo and Uganda for a bit, linking poverty and conservation conflicts again.
The gorillas.
Yeah. The book argues the real threat isn't economic growth in fossil fuels, it's poverty and the reliance on wood fuel right near their habitats.
That demand for charcoal and wood.
Exactly. And it mentions that park director, Emmanuel de Merode, being shot. It makes you ask, why would someone trying to help locals be targeted? It hints at the complex, sometimes dangerous dynamics.
And the Batwa people being evicted from Windy Park in Uganda over poaching concerns. The book calls them conservation refugees.
That's a powerful term. It mentions a study finding signs of premature aging in indigenous people displaced for a lion sanctuary in India. The stress is immense.
And just the daily conflict, crop raiding by baboons, elephants around Virunga, it's a constant struggle for people living on the edge of these parks.
There's a story from a primatologist in Cameroon where conservation literally became a bad word locally because people felt pushed out without any real benefit.
It really hammers home the need to involve local communities, address their needs.
The book criticizes narratives that portray wildlife protection as needing less economic growth and eating outside, often European, management of African parks.
It pushes back on that.
Yeah, it shares this observation that Virunga actually had more large animals and fewer problems back when it was run by Congolese staff with less money, compared to later periods with more funding and infrastructure, but declining wildlife and more farming encroachment.
Suggesting local leadership and knowledge might be really critical.
And that awful story of Bernadette's family having to flee intruders near the park. It just paints this picture of insecurity that people face, which conservation plans have to account for.
Absolutely. The book also includes a primatologist pointing out that if you scare away responsible companies, you might just open the door for less scrupulous ones to exploit resources anyway.
Right, the Soko oil example.
Yeah, and the same primatologist helped Total drill more sustainably in a Ugandan park, emphasizing building local capacity is key.
Okay, now for maybe the most provocative title, Sweatshops Save the Planet.
Yeah, that one definitely makes you stop and think.
It starts with Extinction Rebellion again, protesting London Fashion Week with slogans like Fashion Ecocide.
Pretty extreme language.
And the book uses this to launch into an argument for industrialization, arguing that despite the valid criticisms, it's been essential for progress and can ultimately benefit the environment.
How does it make that case?
Through stories like Supardi's, the Indonesian factory worker, she moved to the city to support her family, yes, but also seeking more freedom, more control over her own life, like who she married.
Bringing in the human element again.
Yeah. The book argues that prosperity, driven by energy and machines, frees people from back-breaking labor for more, well, mentally engaging work. And moving to cities often empowers women, giving them more options than in traditional rural settings.
Okay, so linking economic development to individual empowerment.
But then it throws in the Jevons paradox. Can you quickly explain that again?
Sure. It's that counterintuitive idea that when technology makes using a resource more efficient, we actually end up using more of it overall because it becomes cheaper, easier to use.
Like cheaper, fuel-efficient cars leading to more driving.
Exactly. Or more efficient lighting, leading to people lighting up more spaces more often. Efficiency gains don't always equal less consumption overall.
Got it. So this leads into energy density and land use.
Right. Densely populated countries often use less energy per person. And there's this trend where countries initially use more energy per unit of GDP as they industrialize.
Before becoming more efficient later on as they deindustrialize or shift to services.
Precisely. And historically, development has always meant using more energy. But the book makes a striking point about land use.
The 0.2% statistic.
Yeah, all our power plants, hydro, fossil, nuclear, use less than 0.2% of ice-free land. Food production uses 200 times more land.
Wow.
It highlights how concentrated energy production is compared to agriculture, and it compares energy density. Coal is way denser than wood. Power-dense fuels enabled power-dense cities and factories.
Like getting rid of horses in cities actually improves sanitation, even though cars brought new problems.
Exactly. And factory power density has exploded over centuries. Ford's River Rouge complex versus early textile mills, just worlds apart.
The book then circles back to Supardi, showing her at home, the sewing machine, family photos, grounding the big ideas.
You know, those details matter. The scooter helmet, the prayer rug. It makes the economic trends feel real.
Okay, next section. Greed saved the whales, not Greenpeace. Another attention grabber.
Definitely. It starts by just appreciating the blue whale, this incredible, massive creature.
Right, largest animal ever. But they were hunted relentlessly for oil.
Until kerosene came along, thanks to the discovery of petroleum. The book mentions that old cartoon of whales celebrating kerosene.
Yeah.
Because it argues that the substitute, kerosene, was what really killed the whaling industry, not necessarily just scarcity of whales or conservation campaigns alone at that point. a better, cheaper alternative emerged.
Which leads to Marchetti's energy substitution model.
Yeah, from IASA. He looked at energy sources like commodities competing with each other, wood versus coal, coal versus oil, and so on.
And he found predictable patterns.
Amazingly predictable patterns across hundreds of energy transitions. And things like wars, price shocks, depressions. They didn't really change the long-term rate of transition.
So the market often moved on from an energy source long before it ran out, because something better came along.
That's the core finding. It challenges the simple idea that we only innovate when we're about to run out of something. Often we switch because a superior alternative becomes available.
Okay, let's talk natural gas and fracking. Contentious topic.
Very. The book mentions that debate about flammable tap water sometimes happening even before fracking was common in certain areas. Just adding context.
But the main point seems to be that the fracking revolution, making natural gas cheap and abundant, is a major reason U.S. carbon emissions from energy went down significantly.
Yeah, replacing coal and power plants. The book cites a 13% drop between 2005 and 2018, largely attributed to that switch.
It takes on Bill McKibben's argument that coal is better than gas.
It does. Arguing McKibben uses a shorter time frame, 20 years, for methane's warming potential, which makes gas look worse short-term. But the standard, used by the U.S. government and most scientists, is 100 years, which shows gas is significantly better than coal long-term.
And despite more gas production, methane emissions actually went down for a while.
Yeah, the EPA reported a drop by 2013, which the book credits to better technology reducing leaks during extraction and transport.
Plus, less mountaintop removal coal mining because of cheaper gas.
Which is a huge environmental benefit, given how destructive mountaintop removal is compared to, say, the more localized impacts of fracking.
Okay, back to the oceans. Aquaculture, fish farming.
Right, presented as a solution to overfishing wild stocks.
It's now like half of all fish we eat. And growing fast.
Yeah, faster than other food sectors.
Yeah.
And moving farms onto land offers benefits less impact on oceans, closed systems, potentially even using genetic engineering to improve things, like disease resistance.
But some green groups are critical, right? Worried about escaped fish, waste, the GMO salmon?
Definitely. It's not without controversy. There are valid concerns being debated about how to do it sustainably.
Okay, onto the meat-free nothing burger section, questioning vegetarianism as a major climate fix.
Yeah, the author starts with a personal anecdote about not wanting to eat pigs as a kid.
Right, but it acknowledges the environmental arguments, IPCC reports, media saying we need to eat less meat, change land use, plus the health aspects.
The common argument is less meat, especially switching to free range, means more land back to nature.
But the book pushes back. It says that IPCC emission reduction target only applied to agricultural emissions, just a slice of the total pie.
Okay.
And it cites research suggesting going fully vegetarian might only cut your total personal greenhouse gas emissions by like 4%, maybe only 2% of total energy use.
Much smaller than often claimed.
And remember that point about U.S. meat production doubling while livestock emissions actually fell by 11%? Due to efficiency gains.
Right, intensification again.
It also challenges the idea that free range is always better environmentally, like Four argues in Eating Animals. In a crowded world, is it sustainable?
Because pasture-raised beef uses way more land.
Yeah, like 14, 19 times more land per kilo than industrial beef, and generates 300, 400% more emissions because of diet, lifespan, manure, methane.
Wow, that's a stark difference.
But it does mention Temple Grandin's work making cattle handling more humane actually improved efficiency, too.
So welfare and productivity aren't always opposed.
The book also touches on potential bias in advocacy, that farmer feeling misrepresented. A nutritionist may be starting with a vegetarian bias, the fact that many self-proclaimed vegetarians eat meat sometimes. Even Four apparently did occasionally.
Right, the complexity of human behavior versus stated ideals.
But it credits Four with a more nuanced point, too, that our feelings about eating animals are tied up with our deeper intuitions about being human.
A more philosophical point.
Okay, nuclear energy. The book talks about its negative learning curve.
Meaning it's gotten more expensive and slower to build over time, unlike solar and wind, which got cheaper.
Yeah. It introduces Jerry, who works in nuclear safety, her personal connection through her mother's illness.
Adds that human perspective.
And it traces the history of opposition. The Sierra Club initially supported nuclear, then fought Diablo Canyon.
Interesting shift.
A key figure, Siri, argued for a high-energy society to save nature. Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace vision.
A very different era.
But then the opposition shifted, focusing on fear of radiation, inspired by studies on strontium-90 in teeth. That became the main argument against Diablo Canyon, not just aesthetics.
The fear factor.
And then the China Syndrome movie, 3 Mile Island accident.
Right.
Public opinion really turned.
Hollywood hasn't helped either, right? The Simpsons and the glowing green rods.
Totally. It shapes perception.
So the book argues anti-nuclear activism had real consequences, driving up costs, making it harder to build. And groups claiming market forces killed nuclear even as electricity demand rose.
And that these groups continue to, well, frighten the public, exaggerate risks, claim renewables alone are enough.
Right. It also tackles the terrorism fear nuclear materials being stolen. Cites experts arguing state-sponsored nuclear terrorism hasn't happened despite opportunity, and the idea of eliminating nuclear weapons being maybe unrealistic, potentially destabilizing.
So what about the renewables the anti-nuclear groups champion? The book questions their practicality, especially for developing countries.
That ecolodge in Uganda needing a diesel generator after one cloudy day highlights the intermittency issue.
And local opposition to renewables, too, like that wind farm in New England facing pushback over landscape impacts. Wind farms also need a lot more land than gas plants.
Yeah, the land footprint is significant. The book mentions renewable growth slowing globally in 2018, citing pessimism about scaling up due to physical, environmental, economic limits. Quotes Der Spiegel saying the German wind boom might be over.
It even references an 1833 utopian vision for renewables that underestimated intermittency. And the solar impulse plane, amazing tech, but couldn't carry much, very slow compared to jets. Power density matters.
Nuclear and gas plants are power dense. Solar farms need vast areas.
And building renewables has its own impacts, land clearing, habitat destruction, like the desert tortoises at Ivanpah.
Materials, waste, solar panels, turbine blades, often more materials per unit of energy than nuclear, and worries about toxic waste ending up in developing countries.
It critiques Elon Musk's vision for a solar U.S., pointing out the insane amount of battery storage needed and the prohibitive cost.
Politics and money obviously play a huge role too. The book mentions that environmental law group, ELPC, fighting nuclear subsidies in Illinois while backing wind and solar subsidies.
And the head of that group having a long anti-nuclear history, claims about job creation being potentially misleading.
It also revisits Jerry Brown's anti-nuclear past in California, protesting Diablo Canyon. The irony of canceling a nuclear project over corruption concerns, then pursuing oil and gas projects with the same family involved.
Raises questions, yeah. Potential conflicts of interest with appointees, energy interests, and the ongoing push to close Diablo Canyon, involving some of the same players from the Songzest closure.
A complex web of interests.
The UN's idea of leapfrogging poor nations skipping fossil fuels straight to renewables, the book is skeptical.
Yeah, citing research that says no nation has gotten rich that way. Historically, development required cheap, abundant energy, mostly fossil fuels.
The 1987 Our Common Future report paid lip service to wood fuel problems, but pushed renewable sufficiency for developing nations without much evidence it could work for primary development.
And the irony of Gro Brundtland from oil-rich Norway chairing that commission. Did she really think poor nations could bypass the energy sources her own country used?
A former World Bank economist is quoted saying, "Focusing just on corruption won't lift poor nations out of poverty either. Development is more complex."
The book suggests that as climate became an elite concern in the 90s, efforts ramped up to cut off funding for cheap energy projects in developing countries, potentially hindering their progress.
Which brings us to this clash of ideas. Humanism versus Malthusianism.
Right. Enlightenment, humanism, belief in reason, progress, technology, enabling more people to live well on less land. Optimistic.
Versus Malthus population inevitably outstrips resources, leading to famine, crisis. Pessimistic.
The Irish potato famine is used as an example, but the book notes Ireland was exporting food while people starved, and British elites blamed the Irish, a Malthusian framing.
Contrasted with the TVA and the U.S., a humanist project investing in infrastructure to lift people out of poverty.
But some conservation leaders embraced Malthus. Paul Ehrlich's population bomb, predicting mass starvation, his negative views on the poor.
Lovins and Ehrlich even worried about cheap energy, fearing how people would use it.
Which leads to triage. The idea, pushed by Ehrlich and Holdren, that some populations, like India, Bangladesh in their book, might be beyond saving and should be left to their fate.
Grim. And the book notes a shift in the U.S. Democratic Party from the pro-abundance TVA era to endorsing limits to growth by the 80s under Carter.
As Malthusian ideas about population resources faded a bit, the focus shifted to climate change as the new potential apocalypse.
Climate scientists like Stephen Schneider embraced Malthusianism, invited Ehrlich and Holdren to talk to his colleagues.
And this ideology, the book argues, fuels opposition to development in poor nations, like international rivers fighting the Grand Inga Dam in Congo.
A huge hydro project with potentially massive benefits.
Yeah, international rivers has stopped many dams, mostly in poor countries. The book cites an instance where they apparently misrepresented local opposition in Uganda.
And Grand Inga is power-dense, relatively low impact compared to dams in, say, Switzerland or California. Why oppose it there but not call for removing dams in rich countries?
Good question. It's just an ideological bias.
The book also hits on the politicization of climate science itself, an IPCC author feeling pressure to exaggerate impacts for media attention.
And the attacks on Roger Pielke Jr. for his nuanced views on disasters, accusations of Exxon funding, which he denies, labeled a denier by the Center for American Progress.
Whose founder, John Podesta, then went to the White House to lead climate policy. Connections.
So what's driving the alarmism, according to the book?
It argues climate change has to compete with other global issues, poverty, conflict. Figures like McKibben see it as the ultimate apocalyptic threat, linked to a spiritual failing, a disconnection from nature due to capitalism.
A deeper, almost religious motivation.
Exactly. The book suggests environmentalism acts like a secular religion for many elites, provides purpose, good guys, bad guys, uses science for legitimacy. It argues it subconsciously echoes Judeo-Christian myths. Paradise lost, a fall from grace.
Fulfilling psychological needs for meaning, urgency, community.
It references Ernest Becker's denial of death, our need for immortality projects, finding external demons to conquer, to feel heroic.
So apocalyptic environmentalism taps into these deep psychological currents.
It distinguishes between fearing death and this almost excitement about the end of the world you sometimes see. Mayan calendar, Y2K, climate.
A weird dynamic.
Circling back to the tube protest, the author's reaction, the commuters' panic.
And the spokesperson justifying it to raise election awareness even after it backfired publicly.
But the book ends on a more positive note, listing hopeful trends.
Like what?
Declining land use for meat, forest regrowth in rich nations, potential for poor nations to develop and adapt, falling deaths from extreme events, less animal cruelty, potential for technology to grow habitats.
So the message is, focus on accelerating those positive trends, not trying to reverse progress.
Yeah. It gives a quick update on Supardi, married via Facebook, pregnant, difficult birth. Life continues with its challenges.
And the author frames his own work as environmental humanism, seeing nature and prosperity for all as a moral goal and immortality project.
He shares seeing the gorillas in Virunga after visiting Bernadette, that Eden inside the apocalypse. The ranger's passion for protecting them.
Driven by love, not just utility.
Right. Saving species because we value them intrinsically. The book concludes mentioning his work with others trying to save nuclear plants, seeing nuclear as vital for climate, organizing pro-nuclear demos inspired by Greta Thunberg.
Bringing it full circle.
Wow. Okay, that was definitely a deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, challenging some common narratives around environmental issues.
Absolutely. It really underscores how complex these issues are.
Yeah.
It's rarely as simple as the headlines make it seem. You really have to look beyond the alarmism, dig into the science, the economics, the human stories.
So for you listening, the takeaway isn't a simple answer. It's more about thinking critically. How do we balance genuine environmental concerns with human needs, human aspirations? What's the real role of technology versus, say, lifestyle changes?
Yeah, and based on everything we talked about, which narratives actually seem most likely to lead to good outcomes for people and the planet? It's something to keep reflecting on.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.